Can the odor of marijuana by itself establish probable cause for an officer to search your car on a traffic stop? We're going to talk about that today, and really the answer is it depends. It depends on what state you're in, and it depends on the facts of your situation. But I'm going to jump into this because I want to read to you a story that I found that actually kind of goes perfectly along with this, and maybe yourself or other people that you know have found themselves in this situation. So one example is this gentleman by the name of Orlando Dixon. He had actually just been driving. He went to pick up his daughter, and as he stopped at a red light, he noticed a cop car behind him. And even though he wasn't speeding, he wasn't doing anything illegal, he began to get the impression that the officer was really kind of right on his tail, looking for anything that he might be doing that was wrong. Now, let me add these facts into there. He was also a young man. He was in his 20s. He happened to be African American. So how did this turn out? Well, he ended up getting pulled over. When he did get pulled over, immediately he had to provide, because of the state that he was in, his license, and he had to make sure and also provide his registration. Now, the officer grabbed that license and registration, went back to his vehicle, ran his background, wanting to make sure he didn't have any active warrants or anything like that. Then he came back, and you want to guess what the officer asked him? He said, "Hey, man, any chance I could search your vehicle?" Okay, this was his question. After he asked him that, Dixon said he told him he would not authorize him to search his vehicle. So then the officer began to look around. He got in a little closer into that near the window, and he said something like this. I think I smell the burnt odor of marijuana. I'm going to need you to get out of the car." This is exactly the subject we're going to talk about here today. Because of the officer getting a whiff of pot, supposedly the odor of marijuana, is that enough to ask this gentleman to get out of his car and search his car and be able to basically find whatever he can within that car? Now, that's what happened to this poor guy. And now for him, there was nothing that was found. There was nothing that was wrong, but he was held on the side of the road for over 45 minutes. They continued to search his car. He was displaced with his daughter on the side of the road and missed the event that he was supposed to be taking her to. And so this issue happens all over the country. We see it taking place all of the time. So the first thing I want to do is start to break this down and talk about how police officers rely upon this all the time. In fact, they use this as a tactic in order to get into your vehicle and establish probable cause. And so think about this for just a minute. For decades, this has been used as a tactic because why? If marijuana is illegal in the state that you're in, then arguably they could make the determination that if they smell the odor of marijuana, then that might establish enough evidence to then warrant a search, a warrantless search, right? They don't have to get a warrant. They can now at that moment search your vehicle. So let's identify some of the states that we know have fought against this and it's no longer applicable. And let's talk some distinctions between what state you might be in and how it affects you. So let's first start off. One of the examples that we see here is, for example, in Maryland. In Maryland, one of the laws that was passed, it basically says 10 grams or less of marijuana has been decriminalized. And so as a result of that, the appellate court has come back and said that the odor of marijuana by itself is insufficient to establish reasonable suspicion of criminal activity and not enough to establish probable cause for a search as well. Same thing in Colorado. The Colorado Supreme Court also threw out drug convictions in 2019, and since then, based upon that the police had no reasonable suspicion or justification whatsoever to hold, in one example, a man in his truck waiting for a dog to show up, a drug dog to show up, and then they sniffed his vehicle. They threw out that conviction because they said, why? Well, marijuana is legal in that state, and because it is legal, it has been decriminalized. That does not provide a reasonable suspicion or probable cause for the officer to do anything as it relates to the so-called whiff of pot. Now, this isn't always the case in every state. For example, in Michigan, the Michigan Supreme Court has said that it is permitted. Now, even though that if here's the rule in Michigan, if it's anything less than 2.5 ounces of pot, then that has been decriminalized, but anything above 2.5 ounces is still against the law. So as a result of that, they've come back and said, well, because there is some illegality associated with possessing marijuana, then we're going to say if the officer smells it, then there may be a chance there's more than 2.5 ounces there. So it's allowed there. Another example is in Florida. Even though, in every one of these states, the laws change to some extent every year. Medical marijuana is allowable, just like it is in Texas. If you have what's called a Texas Compassionate Care Act card, if you're approved through a doctor, But they have said because it's only legal for medicinal purposes, if an officer smells the odor of burnt marijuana, that can be the basis for them to then have a search of your vehicle, and therefore it's legal. Okay, so notice one of the first questions you have to ask yourself is the state that I'm in, is marijuana illegal or is it legal? If it's illegal, then there's a very good chance that the courts are going to rule that the so-called whiff of pot is the basis for them to be able to do a search without a warrant. So that can be enough to establish reasonable suspicion, or in this case, probable cause, to be able to search your vehicle. If you're in a state where it's completely legalized, like you're talking about Colorado, you're talking about the example of in Maryland, then you're going to be more protected there. Okay, so let's talk about how to handle this situation when you're dealing with a police officer. Let's say he comes up to you. Here you are in your car. You've been pulled over. Now the officer's going to go and speak to you like he did Mr. Dixon here and start asking you some questions. What should you do? Now, in fact, before I even break down the exact steps you should take, I want you to know I have seen literally thousands of police reports at our criminal defense law firm where this common tactic is used. So this is what a lot of police officers in Texas will do. They will be following you for a certain period of time, similar to what they did to Mr. Dixon, and they'll look for any ticky-tack reason to pull you over, for any traffic violation. For instance, let's say you stopped right over the crosswalk at a stop sign or at a stoplight. They'll use that and say, "Ooh, traffic violation. You didn't stop far enough back." Or maybe you signaled a lane change, but you didn't do it within 50 feet, or they believe that you didn't do it within the time frame provided under your traffic code, depending on what state you're in. What they'll do is they'll make estimates on that, and they'll use that as a basis to establish reasonable suspicion to pull you over. Well, the moment they pull you over, what are they going to do? And now they want to interact with you and start having conversations. And if there's something they either see in plain view, or there's something they just don't like about the way something smells, whatever that is, because remember, it's going to be the officer's word against your word at that point. Now they can use it as a basis to search your vehicle. So I want to remind you about this. It's extremely important here that you're careful about this. In states like Ohio and Texas, it's very common that officers will have a canine unit, a drug dog, literally nearby. I've seen it where an officer pulls someone over to give them a traffic ticket, which many times they don't even write the traffic ticket. They just use that as the basis to pull them over. And then there will literally be a drug dog 30 seconds away, and they're using anything they can as a basis to then be able to search that vehicle or run the drug dog around that vehicle. Okay, so let's discuss this for a few minutes as we look at this. First of all, what are some of the steps you should take if you find yourself being pulled over and maybe that's the situation? You've done nothing wrong. Number one, when an officer comes up and approaches you, roll down your window slightly, hand them what's required in your state. Most of the time, that's going to be certainly your driver's license. That's normally required. And in many states, you're going to be required to provide registration of your vehicle. Why? Because if you don't provide proof of registration, that's actually a traffic offense. That can be a basis for the officer to now search anyway. So if you're not at least following the basic traffic laws and you don't have proof of registration, that can be a basis for the officer to do more. But you don't have to engage in any conversation. The most important thing is be polite, be quiet, provide them the proof, let them run it, and just basically don't open your mouth any further. Number two, don't engage in any small talk. I know this is hard. Many times people will want to engage in small talk. You'll feel nervous. The officer will walk up and start speaking to you, and you'll feel like you have to just continue to talk. This is actually what the officers are trained to do. If they can get you to talk more and more and more, they're allowed to now be able to establish that they don't like either your body language or they feel like you were holding something back, or they can use that as a basis now to establish probable cause, potentially to search your vehicle. So one of the things you can do is don't engage in any small talk. And if the officer starts asking you a number of direct questions, trying to aggressively get you to engage in conversation or ask where you're coming from, where you're going, what are you doing, what's in your car, remember, you can exercise your Fifth Amendment right to remain silent, but you must actually say it. There's case law out there that if you just remain silent without actually exercising that right, the officer can actually use your silence against you. I actually have a video that I covered this issue. This is really important to remember. So what do you say? Officer, I exercise my right to remain silent and I refuse to answer any other questions. That's number two. Number three, ask the officer if you are free to leave. Understand how the way cops work. A lot of times what they're going to do is they're going to walk up to you and they're going to start speaking to you. They'll grab your driver's license, your registration. They'll go run to see if you have any warrants, and then they'll walk back up to you and start this small talk. But what they're really going to be doing is trying to delay as long as they can. If they're going to claim they smell the whiff of pot coming from your car, they're also likely going to call for a drug dog to come out because they're going to want to do a more thorough search. Or even if they don't smell, let's say they don't smell pot at all and they don't use that as an excuse, they're going to want to prolong this so they can have the drug dog show up. So one of the things that's really important for you to do is to ask, "Officer, am I free to leave?" This will force the officer to answer one way or the other. If he answers no, then now you have made it clear you wish to leave and you're asking if you are free to leave. And now the clock has definitely been going and starting here because an officer is not allowed to prolong a traffic stop any longer than is necessary in order to write you that ticket. This is established Supreme Court law. So by doing this, you're letting the officer know you know the law, and you're also you're helping your attorney. You're helping your attorney so that in the future, if this becomes a prolonged traffic stop that then leads to a search, that leads to an arrest, your actual attorney can file a motion to suppress to potentially get the entire thing thrown out in court. Okay, so that is a critical point. Officer, am I free to leave? If he says yes, politely roll up your window and drive away. If he says no, officer, at this time I exercise my right to remain silent. I refuse to answer any questions, and then hold pat. Finally, if you know there is no odor of marijuana and the police are there and they're using it as a pretext to search your car, look, don't fight it. The time to fight is not at the roadside. The time to fight is in court. We may all know that there is no odor of marijuana, and that may be being used as a basis against you. But if you're in a state where marijuana is legal, you're in good standing because now you can have your attorney come in contest it. If you're in a state where marijuana is legal, then either way, the officer may legally be able to do what they're doing, but fighting them on the issue is not going to help you. All right, so this is what you know. If you're in a state where marijuana is completely legal, a whiff of pot's not going to cut it. If you're in a state where it's illegal in any capacity, courts are still going to allow it in many instances as a basis to search your car. See you next time.